If you knew that doing the right thing would make your lover's entire family look down on you, would you still do it? I used to think kindness was something you never had to question, until I stood in front of an old man who had fallen from his wheelchair on the side of the road while a whole family was waiting for me to be on time to judge my character. I'm not asking to lecture anyone. It's just, before I tell you my story, I want you to think about that question. Because, in my opinion, some moments that seem small can actually change your whole life. My name is Claire Mitchell. I'm a photographer, 29 years old. I live in Austin, Texas. I'm not the kind of person who's perfect in the eyes of her in-laws. And I was late to meet my fiancé's family because I helped an old man who had fallen in his wheelchair. At that time, I didn't know who he was. I only saw someone who needed help. That's it. But that one action, something I thought was simple, made his whole family turn their backs on me. Until the truth came out. And you know what? The very man I helped that day was the one who made everyone go silent. You might not know this, but my future in-laws didn't like me. In fact, they didn't even need to meet me to decide that. Just hearing that I'm a community photographer living in a small rented apartment in Austin and used to volunteer in Haiti, that was enough for them to label me not their kind. Last week, Jason, my fiancé, hesitantly said, "Claire, this weekend, would you come to Dallas with me? My mum wants to meet you." I was standing in the kitchen holding an old coffee mug with a chipped handle. My heart sank a little. "Does your mum know what I do?" I asked. Jason nodded. "She knows. But, you know my mum. She's picky, traditional, a bit strict. Just be polite. Don't talk too much about your photo projects. Just say you work in creative media. Also," he paused, "please don't bring that big camera with you." I gave a faint smile. "You mean I should turn into the person they expect me to be?" "No, I just mean tone yourself down a little so they can slowly get to know you." I didn't respond. He came closer, wrapped his arms around my waist. From behind, rested his head gently on my shoulder and said, "You know, I love you, but I also need you to be a bit careful, okay?" I don't know why I nodded, even though something in my chest tightened. That night, after dropping him off at the airport so he could go ahead, I came back and started going through my closet. I picked out the cream-coloured square-neck dress. It was modest and bland. I took off my favourite blue stone earrings, put away the handmade bracelet from my trip to the Amazon, and for the first time in a long while, I left my camera at home. I stood in front of the mirror fixing my hair. I looked safe. Nothing about me felt different anymore, but nothing about me felt like me either. I once loved someone before Jason. He worked in finance. One time, he took me to meet his friends at a rooftop party in Manhattan. That day, I wore my favourite linen dress and told stories about my trip to Haiti, and I never got a second invite. He broke up with me a week later, just said, "We're from different worlds." I tried to calm myself after that memory flashback. Jason is different, I told myself. He listens. He laughs when I tell him about photographing an old woman with memory loss, who still remembered the name of her childhood dog. He values me, at least I still believed that. But now, as I stood on the edge of meeting a family he'd never let me get close to before, I couldn't help feeling anxious. This wasn't just a meet and greet, it was a test, and I wasn't sure if I should even try to pass. I got up early on Saturday morning. The sky in Dallas was grey, and the air was cool, like a sign that the day wouldn't go smoothly. I whispered to myself before leaving the house, "Just be on time. Smile, gently. Nod. Everything will be fine." I didn't know that just a few hours later I'd be standing at the gates of the Whitmore estate hands covered in mud, nearly 30 minutes late, and the truth about me would be revealed with no need for explanation. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. A dim, grey light poured in through the small window of my studio apartment, casting a cold glow over the old wooden floor. The kitchen was quiet, with only the soft, steady hum of the coffee maker, almost like it was holding its breath along with me. I sat at the dining table, both hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, my eyes staring into nothing. Part of me wanted the meeting to go smoothly. Another part of me just wanted not to go at all. I sat in the car for almost 10 minutes without starting the engine. My leather bag sat open on the passenger seat, revealing a small corner of my familiar camera, the old Leica I always carried with me. My fingers brushed gently over the worn leather, as if to calm myself. A message from Jason broke the silence. "Don't forget to change your phone wallpaper. Mom doesn't like those gloomy black and white photos." I looked at my phone. The wallpaper was a portrait of an old woman I had photographed, a face full of deep wrinkles, a toothless smile shining like late afternoon sunlight. Part of me wanted to laugh. The other part wanted to cry. I turned off the screen and quickly shoved the phone into my bag. I didn't know why I was hesitating so much. This introduction was supposed to be just a lunch, at least officially. But, in truth, it felt more like an audition for the role of acceptable future wife. I used to believe I didn't need to pretend, that I could show up as myself, honest and simple. But small things repeated enough times can change a person. I still clearly remember the first time I gave Jason's mother a gift, a wooden photo frame I made myself with a black and white film portrait of Jason inside. Back then, I thought she'd find it meaningful, a very Jason image, serious and quiet, just like he is. But a few days later, Jason returned the frame, placing it gently on my table without meeting my eyes. My mum isn't used to hanging handmade stuff like this. I didn't ask anything. I just nodded. The next time I brought back a shawl from Haiti hand-woven cotton from an elderly local woman. I wrapped it carefully and wrote a small note. For chilly afternoons in Dallas. But just like before, the shawl came back to me this time, neatly folded in a paper bag without a single word. Jason simply said, "Mom said no need to be so dramatic. She doesn't use things like this." I used to think I wasn't easily hurt. But those rejections, no harsh words, no arguments, made me feel like I was fading, like a shadow, slowly being erased from their family picture. After that, I stopped sending anything. I looked down at my camera. It was a part of me, not flashy, not expensive, but honest. I didn't want to leave it behind. But I also didn't dare let it be too visible. In the end, I wrapped it in a thin silk scarf and tucked it into a separate pocket in my bag. I wouldn't use it today, but I couldn't bear to go without it either, like a hidden piece of myself quietly staying close. I adjusted my simple cream dress and checked the mirror one last time in the car. My face, light makeup, hair neatly tied, no accessories, looked back at me with a quiet, almost unfamiliar gaze. I gently touched the engagement ring Jason gave me, round, plain and sparkling. I remembered what he said when he gave it to me. "This one will show my mum you're serious." I smiled back then, but now I wasn't sure whose smile that had been. I took out my small notebook from my bag and quickly wrote, "If today I have to choose, who do I want to choose, them or myself?" I couldn't find the answer. But I knew I was about to walk into a place that might take away even the right to ask that question. I closed the notebook and started the car. The Dallas sky was gloomy, heavy with grey clouds. I pulled out of the parking lot and merged into the busy weekend traffic, not knowing that just minutes later I would be forced to stop. Not because of a red light, but because of a decision that would change everything. The road out to the Dallas suburbs was emptier than I expected. It wasn't pouring, but the rain was steady enough to trace long lines across the windshield, like tiny streams of memories sliding down. I glanced at the clock. There were still over 20 minutes left if nothing got in the way. I'd arrive on time, look presentable, and keep up the act of being the kind of future wife anyone would be proud of. I had practiced every smile, every answer about my passion for landscape photography instead of telling the truth that I photographed the elderly to capture what was slowly disappearing. I had prepared everything except the situation unfolding right in front of me. On the sidewalk near a small roadside grocery store, an old man in a wheelchair was struggling, one wheel stuck. The chair tilted to one side, its front wheel jammed into a drainage grate. A bag of groceries had spilled onto the wet pavement oranges, and apples scattered across the bricks. I saw him reach for an orange, but his shaky hand couldn't hold it. Everyone walking by glanced, then hurried away, as if his presence was an inconvenient problem they didn't ask for. I was still moving slowly, my mind racing. If I stopped, I'd be late. If I didn't, he might get hurt or stay there for hours. Part of me wanted to call the police or someone else, but deep down I knew I wouldn't. I pulled into the nearest parking spot, opened the door, and stepped out quickly, light rain tapping against my face. "Can I give you a hand?" I said loudly as I approached. The old man looked at me, part startled, part exhausted. "I'm fine." "It's okay," he said weakly. But he clearly wasn't. I knelt down and picked up each orange and apple, placing them back in the bag. Then I helped him straighten the wheelchair. He was thin and light, but his body shivered from the cold. I took off my coat and wrapped it around his shoulders. My hands were wet and muddy, but I didn't care. "Should I call the nursing home for you?" I asked. He pointed to his jacket pocket and told me the name of the place. I called, gave them the location, then sat beside him, under a small awning, two strangers, sharing shelter from the rain. "Where were you headed?" he asked after a few minutes of silence. "To meet my boyfriend's family," I replied. "Oh, big day," he said, with a faint smile. Then he said nothing else. The rain kept falling softly. I checked my phone. It was nearly noon. Jason had called twice. I knew I had to go, but I couldn't bring myself to leave him alone. The nursing home said they'd arrive in 10 minutes. I decided to wait. When the staff showed up, I helped them get him into the van, handed over his bag and my coat. "This young lady's kind," the old man told the caregiver. I didn't know his name, and he didn't ask for mine. But I remember the way he looked at me as I walked away, warm, without judgment, without expecting me to be anyone else. I got back into the car, my hands still dirty from the mud and rain. In the rearview mirror, I saw myself not as tidy as when I left home, but strangely lighter. I started the engine, still feeling unsettled. I knew I'd be late. I knew Jason's mother wouldn't accept helping an old stranger on the street as a valid excuse. But I also knew if I could go back to that moment, I'd still stop. I gripped the steering wheel. If they knew why I was late, would they understand? I wasn't sure. But I knew this, whether they understood or not, I had made the right choice. As I turned onto the stone-paved driveway leading to Jason's family estate, my heart pounded with each beat. The house looked like it had stepped out of a magazine. Ivy-covered walls, a white porch with tall, classical columns, and high windows reflecting the grey sky like cloudy mirrors. Jason was already waiting on the steps, his face visibly tense. He rushed out as I parked, opened the door for me, his voice low but urgent. "Are you okay? Mum's really upset." "They've already sat down at the table." I nodded, trying to hide the mess inside my chest and the dry mud speckled along the hem of my dress. I grabbed a tissue to wipe my hands quickly, then walked up the steps like someone about to step onto a stage. As soon as the door opened, I felt a wave of cold air, not from the air conditioning. A blonde woman, with her hair pinned up, wearing a pale blue silk dress, stood from the long dining table in the elegant living room. She glanced at me from head to toe, then gave a tight smile as if I had just ruined a perfect performance. "Ah, you finally arrived," she said. That was Eleanor, Jason's mother. Beside her was another older woman, who seemed to be Aunt Marla, along with a few men in crisp shirts and neatly tied ties. Lunch had already begun. I stepped in, trying to keep a calm smile. "I'm sorry for being late," I said. "Something unexpected happened on the way, and I couldn't ignore it. Eleanor raised an eyebrow but didn't ask. A man, probably Jason's uncle, murmured, "Time is the most precious asset. It's a shame when people don't value it." The air thickened like smoke from an old stove. I hadn't even sat down yet and already felt out of place. A young maid led me to the far end of the table, the only seat left near the window. I quietly pulled out the chair and placed my bag beside me, feeling like I was sitting on the sidelines of a story no one wanted me to be part of. As I poured myself some water, I heard Eleanor whisper to Jason just loud enough for me to catch it. Didn't she have a nice address I pretended not to hear? But in truth, I heard every word like a blade. When the appetizers were served, the table conversation revolved around stocks a golf trip in Scottsdale, a private school raising tuition, and plans to expand a company branch. No one asked me a single question. I kept trying to smile, nod politely, and sit up straight. After a while, Jason leaned over and quietly asked if I wanted something to drink. When I shook my head, he turned away as if relieved he didn't have to act as a bridge anymore. I knew he was tense, but I also knew I was on my own. A woman wearing a string of pearls, probably one of the uncle's wives, turned to me and asked Claire, "I heard you do something in the arts." I nodded. "I'm a photographer. I photograph the elderly, helping them preserve their memories through images." The woman gave a faint smile. "Oh, how noble. But does it actually pay the bills?" Another man chimed in jokingly, "Or is Jason footing the bill from now on?" The whole table laughed except me. Jason laughed too, then reached over and gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze, like an unspoken apology. I smiled back, pressed lips, but no smile in my eyes. And in my heart, only one question echoed. If I'm not who they want, then what am I doing here? Lunch continued with the pace of a shareholder meeting, formal, lacking genuine warmth, filled with topics that felt worlds away from mine. Someone started discussing a land deal in Austin, while another moved on to hiring an Italian architect to renovate their villa in Palm Springs. I quietly picked at my food, nodding when needed, smiling when eyes passed over me. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt it. My presence was like a stain on their pristine white tablecloth. Once I tried to mention photography, hoping to share a sweet story from the nursing home, but Eleanor immediately cut in, changing the subject to stocks. Aunt Marla glanced at me, then smirked slightly, as if I'd just told some unsophisticated joke. Even when Jason asked, "Where did you go last week?" and I was just about to talk about my photo trip to rural Texas, Eleanor interrupted in her even tone. "Jason, you have that New York trip next week, don't you? I've scheduled dinner with the Masons already." My name was no longer mentioned. Every time I tried to speak, my voice was swallowed by a loud laugh, an interruption, or, worse, an awkward silence. I wasn't being heard. I was being tolerated, adjusted like background noise that didn't quite fit. Jason, he was still sitting next to me, but felt farther away by the minute. He tried to be gentle, placing food on my plate, giving me tight smiles when I looked tense. But he said nothing when his mother belittled me, did nothing when I was pushed aside. Only once did I catch his eyes, something like an apology was there, but also that same familiar helplessness I'd seen before. Then came the questions flying at me, not with friendly curiosity, but like a background check. "What do your parents do again?" Aunt Marla asked, her voice soft but her eyes sharp. "Any family property. I heard you live in South Austin," another relative jumped in. Eleanor leaned back, arms crossed. "Do you have any relatives in politics or finance?" The questions kept coming as if I were a resume under review, not a person sitting at a family meal. After the main course, the next dish arrived, a small porcelain plate in the center of it, a tiny golden roasted bird. I heard a whisper, "Ortolan, a controversial delicacy once banned." Eleanor looked at me, her smile paper thin. "Claire, this dish is quite special. It's also a good chance to see where your taste lies." The whole table seemed to pause, eyes turned toward me. Jason frowned slightly but said nothing. I wasn't the least bit flustered. Looking at the plate, I smiled gently. "Oh, Ortolan, a dish with quite an interesting history. It was banned in France due to ethical and environmental concerns, and the tradition of covering one's head while eating it is to hide the guilt from God for killing such a tiny creature. A few heads turned eyes wide. Others gave polite, uncomfortable laughs. I set my fork and knife down gently. Fascinating, truly, but if you'll excuse me, I don't eat birds that are force-fed in darkness and drowned in Armagnac. I stood and excused myself to the restroom, not because I needed to go, but because I was about to break. I needed to breathe. I walked down the tiled hallway toward the back of the house. On my way back, I passed the library, its door slightly ajar, and stopped. A familiar voice came from inside. "That girl. Don't worry. Jason will tire of her soon. I expect she'll reveal her low nature within a few months. No need to do anything." My heart clenched. It was Eleanor's voice. She was on the phone with someone speaking as calmly as if she were discussing curtain fabric. I didn't listen further. I backed away and turned in the other direction, trying to keep my composure. But my heart was pounding so loudly, I wasn't sure I could hear anything else. As I stepped into the kitchen, hoping to find a glass of water to calm myself, the housekeeper, a grey-haired woman in a linen apron, walked over to me. She didn't say a word, just handed me a clean towel. I took it and nodded a quiet thank you. She looked at me for a few seconds, then whispered softly, almost under her breath, "You're the only one in this house who looked me in the eye and said, 'Good morning.'" I looked up. She smiled gently, but sincerely. "I hope young Jason is smart enough to hold on to you." I nearly cried. One simple sentence from the most invisible person in that house was the only kindness I had received since I walked in. I thanked her, though my voice caught. When I returned to the table, everyone was laughing about something I didn't understand. I sat down and picked up my glass of water. In the reflection, my face broke into fragments, distorted, silent, unfamiliar. I asked myself, what am I doing? What am I forcing myself to become? And I wondered, does kindness even have a place in this world? Back at the table, the air around me felt even heavier. The sound of cutlery scraping against plates, wine being poured, soft laughter, slicing through the room like knives. I tried to smile, holding on to the role of the proud future daughter-in-law, but a quiet pain kept spreading from deep within. The meal went on, and I became a shadow beside Jason. No one asked for my opinion. No one looked me in the eye as if I were just an extra chair at the table. Jason leaned toward me and whispered, "Don't take it personally. My mom is just a perfectionist." But the way he said it, as if I was the one who needed to fix myself, sent a chill through my heart. Suddenly, a sharp sound from the head of the table silenced the room. A plate had fallen splashing sauce onto Eleanor's silk sleeve. A small accident, but it startled everyone. The elderly housekeeper, who had been quietly standing behind Eleanor's chair, bent down, shaking and apologizing over and over. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to. Please don't fire me. I really didn't mean to." Her voice trembled, eyes wide with fear, like someone bracing for an unspoken verdict. The table fell completely silent. Eleanor stood up abruptly, snatched the napkin from the housekeeper's hand, and furiously wiped the sauce off her sleeve. Her face was tight with rage. She leaned down, voice laced with contempt. "Do you have any idea how much this blouse costs? Even if I deducted your entire month's wages, it wouldn't be enough to replace it. Carelessness like yours has no place in this house." Aunt Marla raised an eyebrow and added with thinly veiled disdain, "It's hard to find help with even basic competence these days." Another guest shrugged, sipping his wine. "Back in my mother's day, something like that would get you fired on the spot. No one asked if the housekeeper had been burned. No one offered comfort." Jason stared down at his plate, silent. I felt like I was standing on a stage where every role had already been assigned: who was wealthy, who was respectable, who was beneath them, and who was invisible. In my mind, a memory echoed the time I gave Eleanor a portrait I had taken of her mother. a photo I personally edited and printed on the finest paper. Jason returned it 3 days later, saying Mum doesn't like displaying pictures of the deceased. I didn't blame him, but from that moment, I knew the boundary. I stood up from my seat quietly. The housekeeper was still bent over, wiping the floor, her hands trembling. I walked over, knelt beside her, and took a handkerchief from my bag. Are you... Okay, let me help. She looked up surprised. Her eyes were red, not from the sauce, but from shame. No need, miss, please. Let me clean it myself, she said, her voice shaking as if afraid I might get in trouble too. I saw it in her eyes, gratitude, dignity, and deep hopelessness. For the first time during that lunch, I felt like a human being again. When I returned to my seat, I looked around the table. Everyone avoided my gaze. I wasn't angry, I was just tired. Jason still stared down. Eleanor slowly turned her wedding ring on her finger as if to say, "We have standards. You wouldn't understand. Don't try to interfere." I understood. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to explain. Their silence and the way they treated a housekeeper had said it all for them. I excused myself from the table. No one stopped me. No one asked why. But instead of walking out the front door, I turned down the left hallway and headed straight to the back garden. The late afternoon light filtered through the trees, and the air was strangely still. I walked slowly, heart full of conflicting thoughts. I didn't feel weak, I felt free. I had chosen to leave that suffocating space before the kindness in me could be stained by their indifference and superiority. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew one thing for certain: I would not lose myself just to be accepted. A light breeze stirred the hem of my dress as I sat in the garden. The rows of lavender along the path gave off a soft, calming scent, so different from the tension that had filled the dining room just moments before. I found a stone bench under an old oak tree and sat down, letting the late afternoon sky slowly turn a pale orange above me. My hands were still trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from a feeling I couldn't quite name, something like coming up for air after swimming too long in dark water and finally breathing freely again. I took my phone from my bag but didn't know who to call. I just stared at the screen, then turned it off. No one could help me understand myself better than I could in this moment. In my mind, I heard my father's voice. "Claire, you don't have to become anyone else. Just be someone you can smile at in the mirror." I remembered the early mornings at the nursing home where I took portraits of elderly men and women who had forgotten the faces of their loved ones. I remembered the warmth when they held a photo of themselves and said, "Oh, is that really me?" as if they were seeing themselves again through someone else's eyes. That's why I chose this path. Not to make money, not to prove anything, but because I believed that every person, rich or poor, young or old, deserved to be remembered with dignity. And yet, at that dining table, I sat like a shadow, simply because I didn't fit into the mould they had built. I wondered if I had worn an expensive dress, if I hadn't stopped to help the man in the wheelchair. Would they have accepted me more? Maybe. But I wouldn't have been myself anymore. A soft sound pulled me back to the present. Someone had stepped into the garden. I glanced over but couldn't see clearly. Footsteps moved slowly, gently, brushing through the grass. I stayed still, assuming it was someone out for a smoke. But then a voice spoke gravelly plain. "Not many guests sit out here. Evening air's good for thinking, don't you think?" I turned. It was an older man, probably in his 60s, wearing a worn-out shirt and dirt-stained khakis. A coil of garden hose rested on his shoulder. He nodded at me like we were old friends. "Sorry if I'm in the wrong spot," I said quietly. He waved a hand. "This is the earth, young lady. No one can tell you not to breathe or rest on it." I chuckled softly. He sat down on a wooden step nearby and wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "I saw you help Mary earlier. You're a kind one. I nodded slightly and my heart suddenly warmed. It didn't matter what role he played in this house. Those simple words made me want to cry. I just couldn't sit there watching her shake like that, I replied. He nodded. In a room full of silence, you stood up. Not everyone would. I looked at him, surprised by his attentiveness. He glanced up at the rustling leaves above us. People often think money defines worth, but to me, the way we treat those who can't offer us anything in return is the real measure. I froze. That sentence echoed through my mind like a bell. The old man turned his back and started walking away. Just before he disappeared down a narrow path toward the side quarters, he called back, "If you ever need a place to breathe, come back here. No one here will force you to be anyone else." I looked after him, but this time he was already gone. And yet, the words he left behind took root in me. Quietly, powerfully, I stood. The sun was nearly setting. Maybe it was time to go back, not to please anyone, but to stand up for myself. I stepped back into the dining room. The air was just as heavy as before. Every eye turned to me, and immediately Eleanor spoke cold and probing. "And where exactly did you run off to?" I gave a faint, polite smile and replied, "I just went to the bathroom." "Surprised you're keeping track of that too, Mother." The room froze for a second. Then a few people let out short laughs, uncertain whether from discomfort or genuine amusement. I walked straight back to my seat without another word. But Eleanor wasn't finished, perhaps feeling slighted or simply needing to reassert her power. Her voice sharpened, mocking, "Not even married into this family yet and already acting out." I stayed calm and answered plainly, "I'm not acting out. I'm just speaking normally." But she wouldn't stop. Her voice rose with every sentence as if she were delivering a public lesson, flexing her authority. "You should know your place. In this house, respect and discipline are non-negotiable. I won't tolerate your disrespectful tone." The entire table went silent. Jason looked down. I glanced at him, my chest tightening. Eleanor pressed on this time with a dagger's precision. "Jason must be blind to choose a backwater girl like you. I know you're type gold digger clinging to a man for status, but don't dream too big. In this house, I'm in charge. Everything belongs to my family, and I won't let an outsider like you lay a finger on any of it." I bit my lip hard. Everything seemed frozen. I wanted to fight back, to say I loved Jason for who he was, that I'd never asked for anything from them. But I realized nothing I said would matter now. I pushed back my chair, preparing to leave, not in defeat, but because I refused to lower myself to their level. But just then, a loud, firm sound. A door opening sharp and final. Every head turned. An older man was being wheeled into the room. Silver hair neatly combed his gaze as sharp as a blade. Jason whispered, "Grandpa?" Eleanor shot to her feet, her face going pale. "Who claimed to hold all the family assets?" the man said, voice strong. "Who said that I'm still alive, am I not? Or are you all that eager to see me gone?" The room went deathly still, so quiet, the sound of the wheelchair rolling across the wooden floor echoed like thunder. His eyes scanned the room, then stopped on me. I froze. It was him, the old man I had helped this morning, the one who had fallen from his wheelchair in the pouring rain. The old man looked at me for a few seconds, then gave a gentle smile. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon, young lady." The entire table went still. Eleanor frowned, confused. "You met my father?" Harold replied, his voice clear and commanding. No one stopped, except her. It was raining, and she knelt in the mud for an old man she didn't know. No one could say a word. Jason looked as if he had turned to stone. Aunt Marla stammered, "Father, you mean she—" He nodded, then looked straight at me. Her hands may have been covered in mud, but her heart is cleaner than any suit or dress in this room." Eleanor opened her mouth to say something, but no sound came out. No one said anything more. I remained standing silent. For the first time, I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to prove anything. His presence had said everything for me. Jason quietly stood, walked over, and took my hand. In that entire evening, it was the first time. And for the first time, it was genuine. No one in the room dared breathe too loudly as Harold slowly turned his wheelchair to face Eleanor. His expression was calm, but his voice carried a weight that froze the entire room in place. "You just announced to everyone at this table that the entire estate belongs to you." Eleanor opened her mouth, stammering, I just meant to protect the legacy." Harold raised a hand to cut her off. "Legacy isn't money. It's not lavish dinners or looking down on others. Legacy, Eleanor, is how you make someone feel respected, regardless of who they are or where they come from." He looked around the table, his tone lowering. "I've lived over 80 years, and the most frightening thing isn't losing money or reputation, it's living among people who think kindness is a weakness." Jason still held my hand, his grip slightly trembling. Eleanor flushed. "I just thought she was pretending. Girls like her. And you can fake the look in someone's eyes when they kneel in the rain," he interrupted. "I fell in the street, no one stopped. But she did. She didn't know who I was, didn't ask if I had money or power. She just saw an old man on the ground and chose to act." He turned to me, his eyes softening. "Young lady, your hands may have been muddy, but your heart is cleaner than any suit in this room." I bowed my head slightly, unsure what to say. His words felt like a final layer of armor, something I had tried so hard to hold on to all evening. Aunt Marla cleared her throat, then gently said, "Father, you mean, she's worthy. She's the only one tonight who made me feel this dinner wasn't a waste." He replied without hesitation. No one spoke. Jason squeezed my hand tighter, then turned to his mother. "I love her, and I'm proud of her." Eleanor looked at him stunned, as if it was the first time her son had ever said something with such weight. "If you truly want me to be happy, then this is the time to listen, not to control." Aunt Marla reached out and touched my shoulder. "Claire, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to have you take a portrait of my father. I've heard you're very talented." I turned to her and smiled gently. "It would be an honor. I wasn't proud, I wasn't trying to win. I just wanted to be myself and still be treated with respect." Eleanor stayed silent for a moment, then turned her face away. Harold sighed, then wheeled himself toward the hallway. "I'm done with dinner. Not a bad evening." No one dared say a word. Only the soft sound of metal wheels rolling over polished wood echoed in that grand house for the first time, carrying the sound of true values finally being spoken aloud. My legs felt like they were filled with lead. I stood there, unsure of where to look, my heart pounding part from shock, part from something I hadn't felt in a long time, the feeling of being seen. I didn't need to look at Jason to know he was just as surprised as I was. But one thing was clear, I was no longer alone in this room. Harold turned his wheelchair slowly, his eyes sweeping across everyone present, as if judging each of them by how they had just treated me. No one spoke. No one dared. Eleanor stood frozen, all the colour drained from her face. "Eleanor," he said, his voice not loud, but ringing like a bronze bell, "you once told me you hoped your son would marry a woman of character, and now this is how you treat her." Eleanor stammered, I just feared she'd take the inheritance." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm still alive, and I've yet to see anyone in this room show the kind of decency this young woman has." Aunt Marla lowered her head. Jason gripped my hand tighter, his fingers slightly trembling. Inside me, a storm I'd carried all evening was slowly dissolving, replaced by a faint but growing light. Aunt Marla spoke again, her voice shaky, clear. I'm sorry. I misjudged you. I nodded gently, not bitter, not triumphant, just relieved. It's all right, I said. I don't blame anyone. It's just... Today was hard. A cousin, one who had chuckled when I arrived late, now sat silent, his head bowed like a student scolded for failing a test. Harold turned to Jason. Grandson, holding her hand is nice. But what are you going to do about this girl? Jason took a deep breath, looked at me and spoke clearly. I'm going to marry her if she'll still have me. And if anyone in this family disapproves, I no longer need their blessing. Eleanor gasped, but this time no one took her side. Even an older staff member standing near the doorway gave me a small nod when our eyes met. I had never seen a gesture so small carry such weight. Claire Harold said, "Do you have anything you want to say?" I stayed quiet for a moment, then nodded. I didn't come here to ask for pity, but I didn't come to be humiliated either. I came because I love someone, and I believe if a person is truly kind, they don't need to wear an expensive suit to prove it. The room fell still. Harold smiled faintly, turned his chair and said clearly, "Tonight, our family dinner wasn't so bad after all." And then he left, leaving behind a room that felt completely different from when he had entered. No one dared speak of money or pedigree anymore. Jason squeezed my hand tighter and whispered, "Thank you for not walking away." I turned to him smiling. "And I'm thanking you for finally choosing to stand with me." Jason squeezed my hand under the table as if silently reaffirming something important. I no longer needed to explain myself, but I knew this silence wouldn't last. And I was right. As the meal continued, the atmosphere in the room had clearly shifted. The eyes that once judged me now avoided mine or flickered with unease. No one tried to dominate the conversation anymore. Instead, there were awkward pauses, scattered comments about the weather, the food, even the flower arrangement in the centre of the table. Jason glanced at me, and for the first time that evening, I caught his gaze, one without guilt, without hesitation. There was something new in it, pride. He spoke to his mother about one of my photography exhibitions that had been featured in the local paper, even though he'd never mentioned it before. Eleanor only nodded slightly, offering no sarcasm this time. She seemed to still be digesting the shock of her father publicly defending me. I stayed quiet, but I observed everything. Aunt Marla, the one who once said I looked too ordinary to belong in the Whitmore family, after a long, awkward silence, suddenly stood. She walked around the table, gently refilled my glass, her hand trembling slightly, and set the pitcher down with a soft clink. Without meeting my eyes, she said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear, "I'm not good at saying sorry, but thank you for not walking out right away." I paused, not because of the words themselves, but because of the shift they signalled from condescension to recognition, however small. I didn't reply. I simply nodded and gave Jason's hand a small squeeze to let him know I was okay. The elderly housekeeper stood in the corner of the room, her eyes slightly glassy, trying to keep her face composed. When our eyes met, she gave me the faintest nod, as if to say, "Thank you for being here." Nothing had become perfect, but everything had changed. Jason leaned toward me and whispered, "You okay?" I nodded. "Thank you for not staying silent anymore," I replied. He smiled as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. "I'm sorry for letting you carry it alone. It wasn't because I was afraid of them, it was because I was afraid of losing you. But silence is a way of losing someone too, isn't it?" I didn't answer, but the look in my eyes told him I had forgiven him. Suddenly, from the far end of the table, Harold's deep voice rang out from his seat at the head. I'm not someone who's easily moved, but today I've witnessed something that many in this family have forgotten. Kindness needs no justification, and honour doesn't come from where you're born, but from how you live. He paused, letting his words settle, then looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes before continuing. This young woman, Claire, doesn't need anyone's approval in this house. It's all of you who need to learn how to be worthy of her presence." No one dared lift their head. A warm current ran down my spine, not because he defended me, but because he had reset the balance between kindness and power, something no one else at that table had dared to do. After that, everything softened. Not because they suddenly loved me, but because they knew they had to respect me. And that was a meaningful difference. When dessert was served, I caught the gaze of one of Jason's younger cousins, the girl who had earlier giggled along with Eleanor. She smiled at me genuinely without calculation. I smiled back. Kindness, perhaps, is the only thing that truly spreads. I looked around the dining table one last time, my heart heavy. Though the stares had softened and Harold's words had shifted the air, I couldn't deny the lingering sense of not belonging. It wasn't just about status or background. It was the quiet, aching truth that I had never truly been invited into this space with an open heart. I stood up just as dessert was being served, bowing slightly, "Thank you for dinner." No one stopped me. Jason looked at me with sadness in his eyes, but didn't speak. Maybe he understood that I needed to leave, at least for now. I walked down the long hallway toward the front door, the sound of my heels echoing lightly across the marble floor. In my hand, my bag felt weightless, but my chest carried the full weight of emotion, hurt, disappointment, and the defenses I'd carried now cracked. I stepped outside. The Dallas night was cool, a gentle breeze slipping through my hair and making me pause. I stood at the top of the steps, taking a long breath, trying to hold back tears. The air here was still richly elegant, but my heart was worn thin. And then a voice called out behind me, "Claire?" I turned quickly. Harold was approaching his wheelchair, being pushed by the elderly housekeeper. Her eyes were gentle but concerned. He stopped in front of me, the hallway light casting a soft glow on his silver hair, making him look even sharper. "You're really leaving?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. That simple question cut straight through me. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I don't belong here, sir. I don't fit in." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes lighting up. "That's exactly why you need to stay." I clenched my fists. "I don't want to change anyone. I don't want to use myself to prove a point." "And that's exactly why you're worth listening to," he said. "This family is too used to measuring people by dinner's designer clothes or how low they bow their heads." He turned to look out toward the garden, behind the glass doors. "They've forgotten how to see people's hearts." I said nothing. My heart was still racing. "Claire," he continued, "you didn't just pull me from the mud this morning. You did something none of them have the courage to do. You stopped for someone you didn't know in the rain with your own schedule to keep." He turned back to me, his voice slow but firm. "You don't need to fight anymore. But if you walk away now, you'll let them believe that kindness is weakness. And that's something I don't want to see." I bit my lip and looked up at him. In his eyes there was no pity, no challenge, just pure respect, something I hadn't felt from anyone else in that house. "I don't know how much more I can take," I whispered. "You don't have to take anything," he replied. "You just have to be present." Then he reached his hand out to me. "Come on, my girl." I looked at his hand, then at the housekeeper, whose eyes were now glistening with tears. I stepped forward and took his hand, not because I was giving in, but because for the first time in this long, exhausting evening, I felt truly seen, and I was choosing to be myself. I turned back to look at him. Harold's eyes were no longer angry. They were deep, heavy with something older than rage. He sighed, then swept his gaze across the entire table, stopping at Eleanor. "If kindness has no place in this family," he said not loudly, but the words landed like thunder in every chest, "then I have no reason to keep what I've built for any of you." The room went completely still. Eleanor shifted slightly but said nothing. He went on each word like a hammer, striking steel. I once believed Eleanor could carry on the legacy. But during the months I was in the hospital, not once did I see her, nor her husband. Not one word of concern, only revised copies of wills and phone calls asking about assets. His eyes, clouded with age, still burned with conviction. You were all waiting for me to die. No one asked how I was living. Jason gripped my hand tighter. I heard Eleanor choke on her own breath. Her face had gone pale. Time seemed to freeze for a moment until Eleanor stood up, then walked slowly toward him. She knelt. There was no pride left, no authority. Just a woman ashamed, broken and exposed. "I'm sorry, Father," she whispered. "I was wrong. I thought things would stay the same forever. I didn't realize I had lost myself, and lost you." And she cried, real tears falling onto the polished wooden floor. I watched, no longer angry, not triumphant, only clear. I hadn't won, because this was never a battle. This was a choice. Harold turned to me, nodding slowly. "Claire," he said, "you gave this family a second chance. Not with words, but by doing what no one else did." I had no idea what to say. He looked around at the others. "I will rewrite everything," he said. "Those who live with honor will keep their honor. But for those who only care for power and money, well, I'm not taking anyone with me when I die." It wasn't a threat. It was a living will. Eleanor remained kneeling, shoulders trembling. She tried to speak, but couldn't. Jason leaned down and helped his mother up, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in him before. Something that came not from rebellion, but from clarity. I never thought I would witness this moment, not because I pushed for it, but because it had simply become time for the truth to be faced. Aunt Marla lowered her head, avoiding Harold's eyes. The others sat quietly. No one dared say a word. Finally, Harold said, "Everything can begin again. But only if you're sincere." He signalled for the housekeeper to push his wheelchair, and just before exiting the room, he turned back. "Claire, if you still want to be part of this chaotic family, you have the right to set your own rules." The door closed, and everyone understood a new chapter was about to begin, if they had the courage to change. 1 year later, the afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows of the exhibition center in downtown Dallas. Along the hallway, neatly framed photographs hung in perfect order, images of elderly couples holding hands, toothless smiles, radiating joy eyes that looked into the past, yet still shimmered with life. Beneath each photo was a short story of memories of loved ones, of small but meaningful moments. On stage, a large sign read, "Memories that Remain, a fundraiser supporting the elderly community." I stood beside Eleanor, who was no longer the proud, dismissive mother-in-law I had once met. She had volunteered to help co-host the exhibition, not to rebuild her image, but to learn how to give. Day by day, she had learned to set aside her ego, replacing it with genuine care. She was still straightforward, but she now knew how to say, "Thank you." And sorry. Jason sat in the front row beside Harold, still the most powerful presence in the room, but gentler now, his gaze toward me, full of trust, quiet pride, and softness. As I stepped onto the stage, the lights dimmed slightly. I looked out at the room full of people, some familiar, others strangers, but all united by one thing they had come to listen to feel. I held the microphone, took a deep breath. I used to think kindness was a luxury, that it was for people with time on their hands or those out of touch with reality. But then I realized on the very day I was insulted, dismissed, and seen as a burden, kindness became my strength. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just needed not to turn away when someone needed help. I paused, then continued. Kindness doesn't demand reward, but when it's genuine, sometimes the whole world turns around to protect it. Applause followed, not thunderous, but warm. I looked toward Harold. He nodded slowly, his eyes glowed. I knew he was proud not of reputation, but of the fact that his family was learning again how to be human. As I stepped down, Eleanor reached out and held my hand. Jason smiled, giving me a look full of love, not flashy, but simply enough. From a girl on the sidelines, I had become more than accepted. I had rebuilt the foundation of a family, not with power, but with something simpler, unconditional kindness. And if you, the one listening to this story, have ever been looked down on because of where you come from, or have ever been hurt because your kindness went unnoticed, I want you to know you're not alone. In today's fast-paced and unforgiving world, it's easy to believe that kindness is weakness, that it's naive. But it's those who quietly, consistently choose kindness, often without recognition, who are the ones truly changing this world. Many of us are finding our way back to what's essential: meditation, journaling, gardening, or simply learning to say no to the things that hurt us. That too is a form of healing, a way to remind ourselves we are worthy of love without having to compromise who we are. If you saw a part of yourself in this story, feel free to leave a comment, share your own story. And if you'd like to keep walking alongside stories like this, stories that heal, follow this channel. Every week, I'll bring you one story, not just to tell, but to touch. Because sometimes the right story at the right moment can be the first stitch for a heart that hasn't yet healed.